I've got a bit of a bugbear around the use of the term fatigue monitoring rather than load response, or this sort of overemphasis on looking for bad news or expecting bad news. And what that report showed again is that they improve across the season.
Yeah.
Elite footballers playing football on the whole get better neuromuscularly, at least in specific metrics.
Okay, we're back. Welcome to VALDCast. I'm Dan Cohen. Welcome.
How you doing?
Good.
Nice to be here.
Good to have you here as well. We're at VALD HQ.
Yeah.
What's the week been like? We're here at VALD.
Slightly surreal,
Yeah.
to see the continued growth. I was here last year, and that was another level of. I was slightly prepared for it this time, but just amazing to see the growth of obviously ForceDeck specifically, but also more broadly, just these assessment tools and VALD as a whole. Growth in so many ways.
Yeah, I think the opportunity to be in person for yourself,
Yeah.
myself, as well as all of our international staff, it's
Yeah.
huge.
Yeah.
You don't get this many places.
Yeah. Some amazing conversations and fantastic.
Yeah. I'm happy to be here talking, not over voice notes as well, which is good.
Well, you don't like the voice notes?
I don't like 34 of them in one day, but
That was only once.
that was a
one
record.
off.
That was a
one.
record. But we're good. We're good. So I'll preface this by we're going to have an informal conversation. I've got a few key bullet points on my laptop here. Whether we jump into them or not is another story. I think when we get talking, we usually go on a tangent, so that's completely fine. But we'll start off with the EPL report, our Premier League data report. You were involved in that with Dr. Matt Bourne and Dr. Morgan Williams.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to jump in and see from your point of view, obviously you've got a big contribution in the document, but were there any surprising findings or any key takeaways from that?
Yeah, I'd say there was, I think the two main things for me. One was a sense of relief in one aspect.
What regard?
Talked yesterday about in my presentation about confirming and revealing.
Yeah.
Right, as being two of the key things. Most of the time, obviously, if you've got experience with athletes, we talked about the practitioners. You get false plates, and a lot of the time you're confirming what you might already know.
Yeah.
And then there's the reveal things that you maybe suspected or maybe you didn't, and that's exciting. So there's, I guess, two things really that fit into that category. Those two categories from the report. Firstly, the sense of relief was that I've done. The work I've done over the years, not always published because of it being elite sport and, but analytics and a decent scale. It's one of those things you think, let's say, looking at 250 Premier League players is a big sample until you see what, went on in the data report and that volume. But what I thought, it was really important because on the one hand, I think everyone has some skepticism around a data lake where how the thing's done, how the test's done. Obviously, it's been clean, it's gone through. And to find that the results or some key results which I'd seen in terms of differentiating metrics that differentiate the Premier League from other leagues on a smaller 250 first team, let's say cleaner in terms of knowing the context, all first day of pre-season, etc. That in this larger piece, it basically confirmed those metrics as being having that same capacity and being useful. So on the two sides, it was a sense of relief for me that on a large scale, the things that I'd believed based on analytics were confirmed. I was saying, I'm not going to be totally disrupted here and think everything I've believed or had reached conclusions about was wrong, which would be scary. One would have to deal with it, but
for sure,
and secondly, it gave me a lot of confidence in the data lake that even though, within that report, as it says, there is probably some injured athletes, there is different queuing, but when you have that volume and you've got processes of cleaning, Dr. Morgan Williams is, put that through and the processes it goes through means that you still get results that are reflecting on a smaller, like more defined cohort of the same group, right?
Sure.
The Premier League. So, it's useful to know that. It gives me a lot more confidence and about that data lake. Now, in terms of we'll talk, I think, a bit about those specifics of discriminatory metrics. So I won't talk about those, but that in the CMJ, more or less, from a profiling perspective, i.e. cross-sectional against other leagues, there was some confirmation there. And from a response point of view, the other thing that I think is really, really important is that, as you know from some of those voice notes, I've got a bit of a bugbear around the use of the term fatigue monitoring rather than load response, or this sort of overemphasis on looking for bad news or expecting bad news. I mean, maybe that's not what it is, but to me it comes across in that way that we're expecting, by elite athletes who have been playing that sport, competition training, its recovery, to always respond badly and to dive, and on what that report showed, again, in alignment with smaller data sets that I've worked on, is that they improve across the season. Yeah. Right. So playing elite footballers playing football on the whole get better neuromuscularly, at least in specific metrics. So again, that was, some relief to say that I'm not going to be shown to be completely wrong. I think a mentor of mine in a university where I was working in Colombia said it's better to be wrong than confused, because confusion never lifts, whereas being wrong, you find out and you move on. But I think, that was important, and I think that's important to get out there against that narrative, which is, often experimental studies, which are, trying to deliberately fatigue individuals, whereas here we're seeing overall, and there's going to be anomalies, there's going to be guys that don't respond well, and there's going to be periods when they don't respond, but overall, from a neuromuscular perspective, at least in those specific metrics, that improved. The one that was, I guess, a bit more surprising, but in some respect, I didn't realize the scale to which the single leg jump was being used well, because it's often not, it's not a clean signal.
For sure.
And, I'm a believer in using both. I mean, if you're going to use one for monitoring, I'd probably, just for convenience purposes, time-wise, clarity of that signal, probably the double leg CMJ.
Yeah.
But it seemed that, like, in those that passed this data cleanliness hygiene, that some of those kinetic metrics that are useful in a CMJ, and I'm for the time constrained or rate related metrics, were also very sensitive and showing responses and not so much discriminating from a profile perspective, but certainly in the response perspective were also statistically significant changes across the season. So it sort of confirms to me that we need to consider, there's a tendency to want one answer about a test and say, is this a good test? Is this a bad test? And I've had this conversation many times around single leg jump, and it's say, it depends. It's the answer no one wants to hear. But we know if you've got good hygiene on those tests, if they're done well and you can check that and people know how to check that and they've achieved that, I think it shows that, that is another string in the bow, sure. another good tool in the toolbox, to not be scared of, or not assume that we can't get that. We can't use it because it's not clean enough. There's another leg swinging, and these things that we know can complicate it.
Yeah, I think with the recent addition on the ForceX iPad app of the steady indicator now, highlighting to someone, this is how, this is the level you need to be at to execute this test with the the appropriate form, it really is going to change the way that we go about collecting single leg jump data now. It's for the better as well, because to your point, I've spoken to Phil Graham-Smith as well. We've went deep on single leg jumps and when to do them, when not to do them, and why he favors them in certain scenarios and why he doesn't favor them in other scenarios. So I think that's a key insight on the EPL report. The other thing then is, if we do sort of continue the train of thought into discriminatory metrics, let's talk about some of the metrics that we've identified from the Premier League to other leagues that significantly change, or they're at a significant difference, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, so I think in the advanced manual we talked about it, and there was I don't remember how it ended up being phrased. Obviously, discriminatory could have a negative connotation, but ultimately it probably seems the right term to use in terms of metrics that discriminate between the elite, the cream of the elite of the elite, and again, classify what's elite. If you're professional, you elite. There is a whole piece on that, and I think she might have been, I can't remember which group did that, but anyway, they, that's to classify there. And what we're seeing is that. So for me, when I use that term, I'm talking about metrics that differentiate on a cross-sectional basis. So, you take a similar period of time, whether it's a one or, pre-season or across the season, or less so across the season because of the influences, then you're getting it contaminated by the load response cycles. But in a sort of similar, pre-season period, that those metrics, which seem to both in professional football, and in basketball, which is, there's a report coming out around that, but certainly, again, from a smaller group analysis presented at the NBSCA in 2019, I was given sanction to talk about NBA and versus college as an example of elite versus sub-elite, and in this Premier League analysis is things like concentric impulse 100. I won't abbreviate and say Con 100. It's not like VALDCon. It's not a conference. It's a metric. And eccentric deceleration, RFD, or rate of force development in particular, but and sort of metrics related there. So when I say metrics related, that's stiffness is another index. Obviously, force over change in displacement, change in force over change in displacement. Those metrics that have either a rate, i.e. they are change in force over change in time, or have a time constraint in which the force is produced, seem to be the ones that discriminate between the elite of the elite and the sub-elite. So from that on that basis, that it happens, or it's seen at least in two sports. It's in football, soccer, and basketball sports, which acceleration and deceleration are really important. I mean, obviously there are other activities, and it's, basketball doesn't have the opportunity to have top speed run in and so forth. So there are differences, but there is a core piece of acceleration, deceleration. And what that means is we're talking about neuromuscular qualities. Presumably we're catching neuromuscular qualities that relate to the ability to rapidly produce or reduce force. And also these metrics are either side of zero velocity. In other words, they're the vertical change of direction, right? As Oliver from 1080 calls it, which I think is a great term. So change of direction, vertical change of direction, and the ability to do that. Stretch short. I mean, we're talking stretch short of the cycle qualities. So those are the ones that that report reinforced. Now, to just add to that, of course, that doesn't mean other things that don't discriminate between elite and sub-elite. So jump height might not be the discriminatory at that level, but certainly through other the pathway of development, you would need to see threshold level, you need to see development of jump. So it's not to kind of minimize the importance of some other metrics that we're more familiar with, like that and concentric peak power and so forth. It's just to say, well, now the fine tuning characteristics, or the ones that are fine tuned by having the demands of those top leagues. Again, chicken and egg, there's a piece there.
I think that's where we need to be careful as an industry, where we can have these sophisticated reports, we can put them out, and someone from a completely different population can look and say, well, the EPL report says this, so my group of pickleball athletes in San Diego are going to do this. So just having that context as well,
absolutely,
it provides the right framework, but we can certainly plug and play those metrics in and out. They're interchangeable. That I guess like the next train of thought, and this is something that we've had those extensive voice notes over, and I think we've actually created a few resources on it as well. But when we look at profiling versus monitoring, let's dive into that, because it's out there. A lot of people will say there's profiling, there's monitoring, which is just your load response, and there's rehabilitation metrics. And we've kind of looked at a bit of an overlap of just 2 rather than 3 categories.
Yeah, so this was actually, I think, leading into a conversation with Martin Buchai at one point. I was thinking about, I've had something didn't sit right with me about, again, this sort of this 3-way classification. I guess firstly, because it feels like when you say profiling, monitoring, and rehab, it's as if rehab is just this sort of monolithic thing. And so thinking about that, coming up with this, and it's like framework. I mean, there's world needs another framework, but just the idea of considering it in a 2x2 format of where profiling is that cross sectional, that pre-season, that status. What do they look like relative to their peers, their positional peers, their level, etc., whatever you're classifying. And then monitoring becomes much more of an individual piece around response to training, response to loading, etc. Now, that is, I guess, in rehab, traditionally, it's almost profiling and then profiling again, or worse, profiling just at return to sport. That's when you get the numbers, and hopefully, obviously that's changed, and you ACO over 3-6-9 months, but also to emphasize that load response monitoring needs to be delivered more within rehab.
For sure. So,
we're worrying about the healthy and how they respond. We should be a lot more interested in acute residual, shorter term responses, and not wait for 3 months to find out. And the other thing is just the consideration of the timing of those tests. And I think something that someone's shown this week, I won't go into a lot of detail, but the typical profile from rehab is that there are periods where there's decreases in performance metrics, and so that's the normal. They've done that and shown that on quite a decent scale, and this is something to see on a smaller scale. Is that if you test at the wrong time in rehab, I wouldn't say wrong time, but you test 2 days after a very intense session, and you're calling that your profile or your status, you're going to be maybe disappointed. But in fact, what you want to see is that they are getting enough loading in to drive a response, but that you're actually contaminating the kind of status with the residual response to training. And obviously you don't want to clear out the train, you don't want to prioritize reducing the training so that they can have a good test score, right?
Of course.
But just being aware of that. So that was the sort of format of 2x2s, to just kind of be emphasize a little bit more, particularly that load response piece in rehab. Also go from fatigue monitoring to load response monitoring, and be a bit more agnostic about it.
And if you, without being too general, without generalizing too much, profiling and monitoring, they happen with the healthy, they happen with the injured. It's the same concept. You may change your testing selection, you may change your metrics,
right?
What's the actual framework of rehab and monitoring and profiling? it's the same
I think
thing.
it's the same thing. And, the one thing, one could argue is after, you could say monitoring is just repeated profiling.
Yeah.
But it sort of tends to be somewhat more contaminated than, whereas if you really want the profile, recognize that you're going to have to try and create a bit of a space between the potentially the last heavy loading.
Of course. It's similar to with the healthy. I think it's the same thing. And I think we do need to take into account that rehab will never be linear, but also athletic development will never be linear.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're
right.
not providing that right load. You have to.
You have to overreach and
exactly. So okay, we can maybe park that one and we move on to my final topic here, which is asymmetry metrics. 10% asymmetry for all metrics.
Okay, that's not one I like. I mean, randomly, it could be right. And I say, so how I would approach this may not be the right way, may not prove to be the perfect way, but certainly, I mean, the way I'd approach it from a team level is to classify, say, level of asymmetry. Now, I used to have these kind of responses going in years ago, to football clubs and talk about, mention asymmetry. Oh, players are asymmetry. So the concept of, is someone asymmetrical or not? There's no such thing. It's the level of. You're not asymmetrical or not. I mean, there are some where you see a 0, then you can go, you're asymmetrical. You're not really looking at whether someone's asymmetric, or looking at whether their asymmetry is abnormally high based on, in the first place, I think we've got to go from a sport-specific, maybe even a cohort-specific, but at least a sport-specific perspective. And what I've used is to take a 0.5 SD of mean for the group and turn it into absolute. I'll talk maybe if we have a minute about directional, but kind of on a simple level, it's just think about magnitude. So lose the sign, whether it's left or right, create that mean, half a standard deviation being elevated asymmetry, and one standard deviation above the mean being very high asymmetry. And just to highlight within a group. Now, more or less, so the 10% for an overall, the concentric metrics, if you take the mean and the SD, at least in professional football, you're going to end up with about 10% is the threshold for mean plus 1 SD. If you look at eccentric metrics, particularly say EDRFD, to a less extent eccentric decel impulse, the mean in football is, we're talking about between 12 to 16%. So 10% would be your below average asymmetry, and therefore you're going to, in a sense, misclassify. You're gonna. So the danger here, in one respect, is that may lead us towards the idea that eccentric is always worse affected by injury if you didn't have pre-injury data and you didn't have context, because you're going to see 15, 20% asymmetry. And the concentric is at 10. So the eccentric is much worse. And actually, in that case, the concentric is further away from normal than the eccentric. So we really need to be, we need to know estimate what's normal. Obviously, if you don't have pre-injury data, you don't know really where they were. There was a study that we did, Luke Hart's the lead author on that, which I always go back to, is that we had return to competition players and compared those who had severe lower limb injuries. And the nice thing about it wasn't just ACL. So it was, in fact, I think there was only one ACL in the group. It was a lot of ankle injuries, muscle injuries, and just looked at the metrics and the numbers for those in that squad who had in the previous year injuries, those who hadn't. And that one identified the metrics which appeared to be remaining elevated asymmetries even after return to competition. So there were some differences there where eccentric decel impulse was was not significant, whereas eccentric decel RFD was. But it also highlighted that, the mean asymmetry in footballers healthy is around 6, a standard deviation of, let's say, 3.
Yeah.
And I've seen that on a larger scale. I mean, that was one team. On a larger scale, the numbers are more or less similar.
Yeah.
Why 0.5 SD? There's a study with Niall McSweeney. It's his PhD. He's the lead author. We had and we did an analysis in ballet, and we used 0.5 SD. I'd done this in a military study of Colombian military cadets and compared 0.5 and 1. And actually the 0.5 cut point was better in terms of the ratio. So this specificity and sensitivity. I think 1 is too high in a group, particularly sports people, the athletes that have already had injuries. So you're already skewing it towards a higher level of asymmetry, possibly because of previous stuff. So I think half an SD is a kind of cut point to have a conversation.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But clearly a player that is, or an athlete that is asymmetrical, one limb is good and the other limb is very, very good, is different from one who has one limb is good and the other limb is poor. So I think that's when we need to go. This is, again, have a conversation, look at overall values and not live only in the asymmetry. So if we're talking single leg, a bigger emphasis on the magnitude, the individual limb magnitude. Obviously not throwing out asymmetries, but just keeping.
For sure.
And in terms of, so, I mean, that's more about tracking asymmetries we might want to talk about. But
well, I do think it's important to say that we talk about profiling, and that's great, and it's a snapshot, a flash in the pan of an asymmetry at that given time. It is really important when someone is monitoring asymmetries over time. For me, at least in my experience with force decks and everything I've done, I've been more interested in the direction of the asymmetry. And okay, asymmetries went up by 2%, but it's still same side dominant, all this type of stuff. But if we see the asymmetry it was typically 16%, now it's 15%, but it's went from 16% right to 15% left, then that could potentially be a response to, for me, at least my anecdotal thought was contact when you're working with rugby athletes.
Oh, okay.
There was often some knocks that we got, and I noticed some changes in asymmetry, but it's just really important to highlight that as well, that we can monitor asymmetry over time, but there's a way to look about it.
And I mean, I think the ideal in that respect, if you're obviously asymmetries in a double leg jump can only be force, impulse, RFDs. We can't get velocity, power, displacement asymmetries, which you can do with a single leg. But those asymmetries are derived from your left and right. Obviously, I mean, this isn't kids science, but looking particularly in rehab, but even in healthy players. I mean, I can remember again back in the day, because I'm seeing the slide in my mind, although I don't know where it's gone now. But 2 examples of a player across the season increase in asymmetry, 2 healthy players. When you pull that back and what's left and right doing, in one case, both limbs were getting better, and the dominant was just improving at a greater rate, and in the other, one limb was stable and the other limb was going down. In both cases, you had an increase in asymmetry. In the first case, I would argue that is completely healthy response. The dominant limb is getting better and the other is also improving, but not to the same extent. And the same in rehab. I mean, you really having on your dashboard the left and right components, I think, is just critical to not sort of misinterpret.
For sure. As a quality assurance piece.
And as an understanding of, so if you're going to track that metric from an asymmetry spectrum, surely you want to know what's driving those, or in essence, that the 2 parts are going, at least in the right direction.
For sure. That's awesome. Right. So I've got one final question for you. bit of a quick fire question, so I haven't briefed you on this. When you look at practitioners out there who are using forced X, but also just forced plates in general, what are some of the biggest things they need to focus on in order to get most value out of their forced X?
I mean, something that Phil Graham-Smith's great presentation this morning, you know, he talked about, in essence, I'll call it data hygiene, but, you know, or he used framed it as the Bananarama principle, which, and you only have to be old enough and probably British to know what he's referring to, but it's not what you do, it's the way that you do it. And I guess, you know, when we were doing this on contact mats, you didn't see all of the stuff that goes pre and how it's done, right? You saw the output. Now we've got a sensitive tool, and maybe sometimes it's approached in a similar way. Get on and jump, and clearly we you know, we're told, and we need to be aware of this. The only thing a force plate measures is force and time. So even jump height, which seems like the simplest metric on face value, is actually in both cases, whether it's flight time or impulse momentum, is an estimate.
Yep.
Right. And then so if we want to try and, as he talked about, get that basic metric in an impulse momentum frame, which I guess is one of the bonuses of having a force plate, you know, 2.2 kilos error in body weight is a couple of centimeters. I can't remember the exact number, but we're talking about, and how does that happen? That happens from, you know, the practitioner maybe not seeing whether the individual's standing still, them not taking those instructions, chewing gum, moving about a little bit. I mean, it's, you know, these are things, we're not in a lab, say, most cases, but I think it's you know, this is the most, once you've got clean data, you know, people say, well, which metrics should I look at? I'm just starting out. It almost doesn't matter once you've got clean data, because you can look at 1 or 3 or 5 or 10. But if the data is not clean, then it prevents you from ever going further or depending on that.
Yeah.
And the other thing, I guess we've talked a lot about this, and again, the blog with Morgan Williams is the queuing.
Yep.
And, you know, particularly if it's a counter movement jump, which is obviously the most common test, then it needs to qualify.
Yes.
You know, you need to demand, it needs to, well, you know, you can go down, but you need, if you're gonna use and interpret downward phase or eccentric metrics, then you need to create a demand on that phase,
EPV,
which is EPV, eccentric peak velocity. So, you know, these are simple things, body weight, obviously zeroing, those type of things, and consistent queuing.
Yeah, we brush over those. We brush over zeroing and weight because we assume the technology is just going to do it like that for us. But you're in a busy gym environment, someone drops a barbell, that will affect zeroing. So small things like that are huge. It's almost the test before the test. And if you mess that up, it has an exponential effect.
I always say, you know, when I go, like, I can go in and I'm brilliant at standing still on force plates. When it comes to jumping, I'm not great. Athletes is the reverse. They're pretty good at jumping usually, not so good at standing still. So yeah, unfortunately there's no medals for standing still, but it's, and I see more and more, you know, the quality of data out there, if that message is getting across.
Yeah.
And obviously VALD are going to implement, you know, this sort of message about anomalies. But yeah, that's it. And the other thing is getting the buy-in of the individual, of the athlete. You know, we're trying to do, most of the time, obviously not in rehab, but we're trying to get a maximal effort. Yeah. Right. So you need to do, you know, use leaderboards, use encouragement. One practitioner I won't mention said that, you know, either player would say punch him in the chest first. So that's probably rugby, but it might be another sport. But yeah, create that culture and environment for delivering those.
For sure. Well, I think that's all we've got time for. You've got a talk to jump into here. We were going to listen to one of our colleagues.
Yeah, looking forward to that.
For sure. For sure. So Dan, thank you for coming on the show. And I guess as a final question, if people want to reach out to you and get in touch about any of this, is it email? Is it social media?
I have after 12 years being on LinkedIn, I've finally sort of updated it to a small extent. Photo is more recently. I think probably LinkedIn is a good place. Believe is it Dr. Daniel
Dr. Daniel Cohen, I think, yeah.
Email is Daniel Cohen 1971 at gmail.com. That's not my age. And the other ones, Instagram, I'm on there, but I don't know yet what the address. I haven't logged in, so I'll get on there. I'll get to it. But yeah,
LinkedIn and email in for now, for sure. Okay, cool. Well, thanks for coming on the show, Dan. And to all of our listeners or watchers or viewers, don't forget to like and share VALDCast wherever you get your podcast. We'll be back very soon.
Thank you, Ryan.